All right, so these notes are to cover our first section of chapter 3. So we're going to start talking about cells. So ultimately we have to begin with cell theory. Now, in these notes, I'm going to talk about the cell theory, but I'm not really going to talk about the scientists that went into the cell theory because that information you can easily find in your book. So right away when you're done with these notes, you're going to have to work on your homework quiz, and you need to know some information. You have to get it from your book. So don't be afraid to open that up on Google Classroom because it's already posted there, right? So in section 1, it'll talk about all the different scientists. I'm going to go over that, right? I'm going to skip over that, excuse me. But we're going to talk about cell theory. We're going to talk about how to differentiate between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So we'll just take care of what we need to take care of in here. Now, first thing in the notes actually asks about, well, what technology would need to exist before we could come up with cell theory. Well, it turns out cells are kind of small, so we needed to have that microscope before we could see them, right? So we had no idea that we were made up of tiny little cells because we couldn't see those tiny little cells. But as soon as we had a microscope, we started recognizing those things, and we noticed that every living thing also has cells, just like we do. So that's kind of a big deal. Right? Otherwise, there were a lot of scientists involved in this cell theory. Again, go check out your book for that. But cell theory, generally speaking, has these 3 parts to it. All organisms are made of cells. That's point number 1. Right? So again, you can't see them necessarily, but if you looked at your skin under a microscope, there's lots of different cells that make up the tissues, that make up your organs, that make up organ systems, that make up your body. So all organisms are made of cells. Point number 2 is that all existing cells are produced by other living cells, right? So that's how we reproduce. That's how all living things reproduce, right? One cell can turn into 2 cells. Those 2 cells could be separate living things if you're talking about a bacteria cell. But for humans, right, we divide our cells just to grow, to develop. But that being said, we use single cells, right, sex cells, to create new organisms as well. So all existing cells are produced by other living cells. That actually was kind of a big deal. We didn't really know until fairly recently, in all reality. I know it's not super recently, it's like 400 years ago, but we didn't really know where flies came from. They just pop up out of nowhere. We couldn't see the tiny little eggs that they laid that turned into new flies. So we just thought they were magic. They just showed up, right? Because they could show up when we didn't see any previously existing, and we had a closed system, and they just come out of nowhere, right? So we've learned a lot since then, and that seems silly to us now. But all existing cells are produced by other living cells, for sure. And then finally, the cell is the most basic unit of life. That means that the smallest part of a living thing that could be considered a living thing in and of itself would be that cell, right? So your cells can't really exist without other cells, right? Because you have a complicated system. You need all those cells working together to exist. But technically, each one of your cells could be considered a living thing on its own. So again, these questions just have to do with that cell theory, right? I will answer them real quick in these notes just to make sure you have something, but you could also pause and think about it yourself. Where do cells come from? It was right there in the cell theory. Cells come from other cells, right? But that being said, that's kind of tricky, right? Because if cells come from other cells, have there always been cells? Right? It's kind of that chicken and egg kind of situation. Which one came first, right? If all cells come from other cells, well, where did the first cell come from, right? And that's something that we've yet to answer, and we don't really know an answer to yet. But otherwise, as far as we know currently, right, if you find a cell, it came from a previously existing one. Next question, if something like a virus does not have a cell, can it still be alive? The answer is no. If there's no cell, it's not alive, right? Viruses can imitate living things pretty well, right? But since they don't themselves have a cell, and we talked about cells as being one of the 5 characteristics of a living thing, viruses inside of your body, inside of your cells, they do have nucleic acid, so they can reproduce technically, right? So they can do some of the things that living things can do. They can reproduce. They can use energy because your cells are doing their bidding to use that energy, but they do technically make that happen, right? But other things don't apply. They don't have their own cell. They can't live on their own. They have to have a host cell to live in, right? So viruses are not technically alive, which is why you can't use an antibiotic to kill them. They were never alive to begin with. Right? You can't kill viruses in your body without killing your own cells that are doing their bidding. So you kind of have to let your system take care of them itself, because your system is good at eradicating foreign things, but you can't just take a medicine that's going to kill the virus, because it can't be killed. It's not alive to begin with. Otherwise, there's a few definitions here as this section talks about cells. Cells are filled with cytoplasm. It's the jelly-like substance that contains the building blocks needed for life, right? Basically, your cytoplasm kind of has the consistency of ketchup, for lack of a better analogy, right? There's so many proteins and so many things that are dissolved in that liquid in the water that's in the cytoplasm that it's really thick, right? It's more like a jelly. It's like ketchup more so than like water that's in a glass, right? It doesn't slosh around or move very easily. It's a little bit thicker than that. Prokaryotic cells are simple cells that have no membrane-bound organelles. The DNA is suspended in the cytoplasm, right? So prokaryotes are the simplest kinds of cells that we know of, right? You need to know that prokaryotes, that bacteria cells are prokaryotic cells. So make sure that you put that in your notes there, right? Prokaryotes, bacteria, kind of interchangeable for us. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. The DNA is found in the nucleus. Eukaryotic cells, the way I remember which one's which, that is pronounced you, and you are eukaryotic. Your cells are eukaryotic. They do have membrane-bound organelles and a nucleus. Otherwise, we'll talk a lot about organelles in our next section, in section 2, that you'll take care of later. Organelles are membrane-bound structures that are specialized for a specific job in the cell. So the most important thing in section 2 when you start talking about organelles is, what is that job? What does that organelle do, right? Because if you can't tell from the definition what does that thing do, then it's not a very good definition, right? Because every organelle has a specific job trying to help keep you alive. And you need to know what that job is if you're going to be able to understand how things are working. Okay, so lastly, you're just supposed to identify 2 things that eukaryotic cells have that prokaryotes don't. You can use a picture in your book for this, right? I could talk to you about this later as well, right, when I'm there. But just make sure you finish these notes and then make sure that you take care of your homework quiz. But remember, you are going to have to use your book, right? There's no way to finish that homework quiz without a book, because you're going to have to know about a few scientists that I didn't talk about in here.